Chairman, members of the board. I'm going to introduce myself first so everybody knows who and why I'm here. And that I first apologize for my casual attire. I just had a root canal a few hours ago, so I'm in a great mood for discussion. My name is Greg Carson. I am the Field Office Director for the New Hampshire office of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. I'm also the Sustainability Community Officer for Northern New England. What does that mean? I'm the senior representative of HUD for everything that goes on in New Hampshire, in terms of everything from Section 8 to endorsing the mortgages on many people's single-family homes to the community development block grants and the Sustainability Communities Initiative. To give you a little bit of my background, though, so you understand, I am a lifelong resident here. I actually went to high school with your fire chief and chairman's wife. I grew up in Salem. I live in Londonderry.
I look so much younger than you, Tom.
Oh. I'm a former state rep, and my wife's a state senator, and I was the secretary of the state Republican Party, and I'm really right-wing conservative in my community, and I'm really proud of it. So, but taking that all aside, I just want you to understand my perspective. The Sustainable Communities Initiative really is a process that's been put in place to develop cooperation between 3 federal agencies that grant a lot of money, HUD, EPA, and the Department of Transportation, and to coordinate their activities along with coordinating the activities of states and communities on what they're doing in terms of development. I grew up in Salem. I watched Route 28 in Salem go from a couple of stores to the behemoth strip mall that it is today. So I've seen the impact of not planning, and I've seen the impact of planning, where you have communities that have done really well, and with zoning ordinances and things like that, so that planning is developed comprehensively, and everything gets considered in that. But the main thrust behind this is determining how the federal government is going to give money to projects through state and local municipalities. Because for a long time the federal government came in and said, well, this is what we're going to do. We're going to build Route 93 and we're going to take it right through here. And thank you very much, Windham, for donating your land, and I don't care if that's not the land you want to donate, it's the land we're taking. That was the mentality of the 60s and 70s and 80s of the federal government. The mentality of the 90s and the 2000s of the federal government is that we're going to give this money in blocks, you hear community development block grant, and we're going to give that to to the people on the ground in the communities that know what they're doing. But you know what? We still have an obligation, a fiduciary responsibility, to make sure that that money is not being misused. And I'm glad somebody actually brought up the Westchester case, because that's a perfect example of when the money's not used for what it says. The Westchester community case that somebody had referred to in one of the clippings. A nonprofit advocacy agency sued what's called can't get this right. A False Claims Act action. What that means is that somebody identified, somebody probably who was on the inside of working in Westchester County, identified that the county had applied for federal dollars, said they were going to do one thing on their application, and then did something completely different. So that person, they said, oh, well, I'm going to say that, I'm going to identify that that went on, and they start a suit, and then the federal government joins that suit, first with the Attorney General's office. And a person gets some compensation for having started that suit. In this case, the nonprofit gets compensated, and that's why you see that I think they get $2.5 million of attorney's fees for the nonprofit organization if you actually read the case. But Westchester County was going to lose that case, and it was going to cost them up to $300 million as a result of that. So HUD intervened, because it was HUD's program, the Community Development Block Grant Program. HUD intervened in that action and helped negotiate a settlement, so that the settlement's going to end up being initially $50 million, and over a period of time, $100 million, most of that recouping the money that Westchester had spent. Where HUD is now, as part of that process, is now making them spend that money again in the ways that they originally said they were going to do, and then, like I said, part of the settlement. So we have that fiduciary responsibility to stand in there and make sure that the money is being done well. And when you see the grant application and all those things about HUD's substantial involvement, that's what we're talking about. Our substantial involvement is to make sure that taxpayers' dollars are actually being used for what communities, or in this case, the regional planning commissions, said they were going to do. I mean, that is a fiscally responsible thing to do. That's what we want the federal government to do. We want them to make sure that our tax dollars are being spent wisely. And I take that very personally. And Cliff and Kerry and David Priest and I can tell you that we keep a close eye on the dollars and cents here in this state. folks at the state level can also tell you the same thing. So that's why we have an agreement that says, hey, I can look under the covers anytime I want to, because I want to make sure that your money's not being misspent. Because it happens a lot. It happens in small communities, it happens in big communities. You know, you'll see things, they'll be in the newspaper tomorrow morning, I just got a text. You know, people who are paying housing commissioners $600,000 a year using federal dollars to pay somebody a salary to do a job that, you know, somebody should be getting, a third of that or half of that or something. But the idea is that, you know, the federal government identified that and we're taking action. Well, that's the same thing what we're doing here, and that's why there's these owner's contracts. And they say they're very specific things about, you know, there are deliverables. Because you have to create a plan. We want to see that the work was done, that a plan was created, that these sections were covered in the thing. We don't really care what the plan is. The communities will decide what they want, not the federal government. The communities will decide. We just want to know that you actually did the work, you actually went through the process, and you documented so that we could say, when somebody comes back and says, well, what did HUD spend that $3-point-something million with the Nashua Regional Planning Commission? What did you spend? And we said, look, we've got this huge stack of documents here, and here's what they've decided. And we're going to take that stack of documents, and then when we actually go to give grants, whether it's HUD, EPA, or DOT, we're going to say, did these organizations, did these communities participate in this plan, and so therefore they get extra points in the funding. So when Windham wants to get additional funding for impact because of changes in Exit 3, and they apply for a DOT grant, the DOT grant people, you know, if there's a specific, the grants all come out now, whether the language is in there or not, every time the grant comes out, it's a different notice of funds availability. You saw that laundry list of things that people could participate in. And one of those items may be in there. Did Windham participate in the Sustainable Communities Initiative planning process? And if it says no, guess what? It's not that you lose points, you just don't get the 2 extra points that maybe Salem got, or Londonderry got, or Hudson, or Nashua, or somebody else. And that's where the impact will be in the longer run. Okay? And it's probably never going to be a HUD grant. I mean, the only thing we do that you would probably get impacted for is we do senior housing, and you know, you may or may not get money for senior housing project if you want to put it in town, because you may lose it out because those 2 points may go to another town. That waiting list is forever, so that's probably not a reality. But it would be a reality when it comes to EPA, and USDA, and DOT. And that. So there is an impact, or there certainly could be an impact to the community. So I would, you know, whether you sign or not, it does not matter to HUD one bit. It only matters to you and what you decide to do, and whether you want to participate or not. And we think that the Regional Planning Commissions do a great job, and that's why we gave them the money. We work closely with them, trying to get them competitively in the process, so that money would come to New Hampshire instead of going someplace else. It took a couple of cycles to get this grant, and we hope that you leverage it and use it wisely, because I know they will. So that's pretty much it.
Any questions, Mr. Carson?
Yeah, Mr. Carson, thank you very much for coming. I have a couple questions, and maybe you can clear up one of the things that's really bothering me. In reading through this, it seems to be that one of the mandated requirements of the plan is that you reduce vehicular miles, that you try and minimize sprawl, that you accept participation from minorities, represented, I think is the term you use, something to that effect. When I read through this, it sounds so much like this is geared towards a city. Not it. I'm not it either.
Get a hammer on nail, whatever you want to,
Yeah. It's geared more towards a city, not to a community like Windham. And I guess my concern is HUD trying to impose a city style of living onto the rural communities in this method?
That's an excellent point. I should have actually addressed that when I was talking. So, this, I'm going to get going with some ice on my face. All the grants, and I had this issue comes up all the time, whether it's a grant or whether we're reviewing the standards for the local housing authority, or if you have public housing in your city or town, all of those rules, all of those grants are written for communities like New York City, Los Angeles, New Orleans, your big, huge cities in metropolitan cities, Boston. I mean, Boston is kind of low on the radar compared to a lot of those other places. The idea is that they write the grants for the large participating organizations, the large cities and towns. Okay. We got $3 million. Other places got $300 million. Okay, I mean, you know, plan for Los Angeles is going to be $300 million, and that's why they write these things, and they write them generically so that, you know, they can get the impact ideas what they want out for everybody. We at the tail end, I mean, you know, and I say this to our congressional representatives all the time, to our local elected officials, our folks up in Concord, the governor. You know, we're kind of at the end of the stick here. We get wagged every time, you know, somebody in another community like Westchester screws up. We end up on the back end of this getting having to deal with their problems later on because we get these onerous rules and regulations that they implement. Most of the time we get, you know, we now have to convince them to not put small communities or small cities or states like New Hampshire into that big mix, and they get a lot of waivers. But the idea is that those things are written to address where the real problems are, which are in cities. We won't, and we were just up in Vermont a couple of weeks ago talking with other organizations, other planning organizations for the New England area that are going through the same process and looking at these things. It's how to explain that to folks in local communities, because, you know, look, I mean, you're more likely to see a deer on the road than you are to see, you know, a city bus. You know, I mean, I've lived here all my life, and I don't remember, other than driving in Manchester, seeing city buses anywhere. So, you know, how do you address that? Well, the issue is that HUD doesn't even look at those issues for local communities. I mean, you know, let's face it, I mean, this is one of the most homogeneous states in the country. I mean, it's, you know, very, you know, Caucasian state, and, you know, there's not going to be a whole lot of impact for minority communities. There may be some in Manchester, in Nashua, and that, but the idea is that in this plan, if you're developing a plan, is that what you don't do is you don't put something in the plan that makes it more difficult for underrepresented minorities. And those people include, because we're talking about the fair housing issues, that plan includes the elderly, single mothers, veterans, disabled people, low-income people. I mean, it's a broad spectrum of description of people who are traditionally underrepresented at organizations. I mean, you know, you can come to these meetings, or you go to town meeting, and you often see that group of folks are not represented in those discussions. And that's the impact. They want people to have the ability to be part of that, to have a seat at the table, just as you were talking about earlier, to have that seat at the table in a way to actually raise their hand. And in most cases, or many cases, the folks in those groups don't raise their hand. And so the idea is to make sure that people get represented during this process. Again, mostly not an issue here in New Hampshire, but, you know, obviously a big issue in big cities. So yes, the plans are described, are written, and the grant applications are written for big cities. But believe me, when HUD evaluated who's going to get a Sustainable Communities Initiative grant for New Hampshire, those factors weren't even in consideration. We didn't get any extra points for those issues, I can tell you that.
Any other further questions for Mr. Carson? Thanks.
Perfect, thank you.
Anybody else like to speak?